Hey everybody, thanks for joining this week's tech tip. This week we're going to be going through connector patterns in Swood Design. Connector patterns are very powerful and very customizable. We can implement the connectors of our choosing, and utilizing a script we can implement them in very specific ways. And because it's very customizable, we can create very simple patterns all the way up to very complex patterns. And when we create these patterns, it ultimately helps us save us time and increases our consistency in our designs. So let's get to it. So we just have a simple frame here. And here's a pattern that we probably would have made in our Swood Design training. It's the typical connector rule that's dependent on the length of the interface here between two panels. And it uses dowels and eccentric connectors in tandem. So all I did was I created a copy of it by right clicking and going to copy. Called it dowels eccentric mod. And pretty much we just needed to determine a plan for the functionality that we actually want. So we know that we wanted to specify a quantity. We also know that we wanted to be able to move the connector itself. So I chose that when we're only using one or two connectors, I want the ability to move the connectors off of the center, which is the default location. And when we're dealing with 3, 4, and 5 connectors, we really just wanted to specify a distance from the edge. So I'll quickly run through what it would look like. So here we have a quantity of 1. We can drive our center offset here. So if we only were throwing one connector in there and we needed to move it, we can do that. So here when we have a quantity of 2, I decided that I want the 2 dowels to be spaced out at 1/2 the total length of this interface, and again we have a center offset value to move these 2 together as a pair, either left or right depending on the needs. When we're dealing with 3 connectors, we wanted to drop a dowel right in the center and drop a set of eccentric and dowel on either side. And in this case, we didn't want to use a center offset for this particular rule, just because that's what I chose. But we did want to be able to drive the distance from the edges of our interface. So we have a parameter there set up for that. And that parameter actually would have been set up in the previous pattern where it was driven only by distance. For 4, we decided we're going to have 2 equidistant to the center point dowels with, again, a pair of eccentric and dowel on either side. And in this case, we're still only going to drive the distance from the edge. We could add in a parameter if we wanted to specify this distance. In this case, I didn't. And lastly, when we have 5 connectors put in place, we have a centered eccentric, 2 dowels on either side, and again spaced out from the outside, only driving the side offset parameter. So that's just a brief introduction of how I wanted these rules to come into play. Obviously, if you want a different set of rules, you would go about it in a different way, but I'll show you how we'd go about starting this in the first place. So coming back to this main screen, what we're first going to want to do is create some new parameters. So for quantity, we wanted to introduce quantity. What we would do is you would hit new integer value, and from there we can change the name to quantity. We can change the alias, so when we're actually creating the script, this is what we're going to call. We'd probably want it to be quantity. It's giving me red because I already have it defined here. And we'd want to set this accessibility to exposed. That means when we're using this component pattern, exposed means we're going to be able to actually put inputs into that category. We want a side offset parameter, so what we would do there is hit new distance, and again we'd put in the name we want, we put in the alias we want, which is going to be again what's used in the script, and we set the accessibility to exposed. What we also needed for quantity 1 and 2 was a center offset. So I created, again, new distance variable. I called it center offset. That's the alias I chose. And again, accessibility set to exposed. From this point, now we have the capability of allowing the type of inputs that we actually want to. And as you can see, we already have the connectors we wanted to work with. Those can just be drag and dropped out of your connectors into here. So we have a maximum of up to 4 dowels and a maximum of up to 3 eccentric connectors. And this button here is going to allow us to edit the script. So here when we're in this menu, this is where we're actually going to break out and turn all of our logic of our pattern into code that's actually going to execute. So this beginning part isn't necessary for what we are actually working with. What we're really curious about and what we want to focus on is going to be the if statements and else ifs. So we're essentially just going to use a series of if statements, if else, to determine based on our input that we put. So you can see here we're driving purely by quantity. You can also have more conditions in there if you had more variables, but here we're driving only on quantity. So we see we have a loop for each one, quantity 1, 2, 3, 4, and else, which is our final, would be for quantity 5. So inside of each loop, we essentially, all we're going to do is modify whether each state is suppressed or not. So from all of these, for quantity 1, since we're only using one connector, we essentially suppress 3 of the dowels, and we suppress every single one of the eccentric connectors. This line here, soft.expose equals false, what that's doing is it's going to hide the side offset parameter, because in this case we actually don't want to define a side offset, we just want to define a center offset. So you can see here, this is going to be the X position. So the position along this interface, we set it equal to that center offset. So when we use this pattern and we set in a quantity of 1, we'll have the ability to enter in a center offset. And by default, this location will be 0. So it'll want to default right into the center point here. And if we enter any value at all, that will be driving the location. So a positive value will take us to the right, and a negative value will take us to the left. And essentially, as we increase in quantity, what we're doing is we're unsuppressing the connectors that we actually want, and we're leaving the ones suppressed that we don't want to deal with yet. And depending on how you want to lay those out, we pretty much just define them as they are. So what this one's doing is taking the first dowel and spacing it 1/4 of the total length to the right. And it's taking this next one and it's utilizing this value here, so it's taking it 1/4 all the way to the left. And that would give us 1/2 of the total interface distance. And you can see both here that we still allow a center offset input for both, so they would move as a pair either to the right or to the left together off center. Again, you could set that up whichever way you want, depending on the functionality. There are many different options here, but this is how I chose to do it. And again, we hide this parameter, the side offset parameter, because we want to drive it based on its center offset and not its side offset. And getting into quantity 3, 4, and 5, we're pretty much doing the same thing. We're utilizing the parameters here in quantity 3, 4, and 5. We actually hide the center offset because now we're just going to be keeping everything centered, but instead using the side offset to ensure that we can drive the distance from the edges. So obviously you could set up these distances how you like them. You can see that the distance is essentially driven by the name of the connector, .p, which will refer to position, and .x, which refers to the x position, which again is the distance left or right along the interface of the two panels. So we have the option to edit the script. You can also validate, so entry test mode. This is what I was doing before. So as you can see, when quantity is 1, I only have center offset. right? If I go to quantity 3 now, center offset disappears and now side offset is in the way. So we're happy with how our connector pattern is laid out. Say yes. And now if we want to insert some connectors, we have the ability to use this rule. And when we click that, the parameters become exposed because we allowed them to be. And still, just like how we were validating it, when we set it to 3, now we get side offset, but if we set it to 1 or 2, we're only getting center offset. So utilizing these if-else statements and essentially suppressing things either on or off give us all the options we need to drive what we want. And essentially you just put in the location, the X location of each connector, and you utilize the parameters that are given to you in the script editor. They give you all the parameters you need to drive the location of your connectors along the length of the interface. So we'll quickly just try it out. So you can see right now we're set to 2. And if we were to leave it like that, okay. Leave it like this. Now we're going to edit the frame. We're going to make it much deeper, just to show that this isn't driving based on distance. Oops. You can see now above a certain length it didn't add any more connectors. All it did was hold on to that side offset, and it kept this dowel centered. So that would be the way that you can go about creating different connector patterns, not solely based on the length of the model. When we're actually editing our script, here on the left side is where we have all of the available parameters to us that come with it. So we have the list of all the things that we added, so the connectors, and here are the side offset, quantity, center offset. So those are the variables that we made, and here are all the variables that are just automatically there. So the main one you'd want to work with is connector context width, so that's the length of the interface, AL. But as you can see, you have all the references here to be able to figure out how you actually want to set this stuff up. So you have position, quantity, you have suppression, and utilizing all those, just using simple if-else, true and false, and simple math, you can essentially create really complex set of connector patterns that way you only have to use one pattern that can allow various different inputs, and you don't have to worry about creating a bunch of different patterns. And obviously if the coding stuff is still intimidating to you, that's what we're here for. We're here to help with that. So yeah, I hope this was helpful for you, and if you have any questions, just feel free to ask. But this is what our code looks like here. Pretty straightforward. And yeah, thank you.